Hearing on stream number 5 has reconvened. We did have a technical issue there, which may mean that some parties didn't hear the beginning of the hearing start with. We are listening to the response from Janine Gibb-Smith in terms of submitters evidence on the subdivision provisions. And we will resume with doing that. We will ask, we can see that it's probably on your computer, if we were able to get a copy of your notes as soon as possible. It may just assist us in our questions and things, because there's a lot of detail. So,
Otherwise, I've got to read my chicken scroll.
so that would be good. Thank you very much. Okay, so maybe resume.
So assessment matter sub AM 17 relating to subdivisions with building platforms and or vehicle access within the National Grid subdivisions corridor. I've considered the evidence of Ms. Whitney on behalf of Transpower in relation to their request to make a minor amendment to sub AM 17 clause 2, so that it refers to support structures as well as National Grid transmission lines. I do not support this amendment, and that's because I don't consider that it's necessary. The definition of line in the proposed plan as notified is already sufficient, in my opinion, to address Ms. Whitney's concerns, because that definition already includes support structures as well as transmission lines. And finally, in relation to methods, I've considered the evidence of Ms. Price on behalf of Hatuna Line, which relates to Hatuna Line's request to add a new method which states that the council should map the full consented extent of the Maharakiki Road Hatuna Line quarry on the units as an information layer only. I have not changed my position on this submission point and remain of the opinion that it should be rejected. About my section 42A report. That concludes my opening statement.
Thank you. Yeah, as I said, it would be very useful to have the notes. You are able to forward them to Jessie. Good. Good. Any questions from the panel? Commissioner Taylor? I might just start while the panel are thinking. This is just a minor one. On page 28 of your report, you recommend rejecting FENS's submission to the submissions 5 and 7, but I've lost it now. But I thought your actual evaluation was a positive one rather than a reject one. I'm just wondering whether that was just a. So on page 28 in the list of recommendations at the bottom, recommending rejecting the 2 FENS further submissions.
I'd have to check that.
Yeah, it's probably, I could put you on the spot at the moment. There's a more broader question. So on the topic of hazards and subdivision, on page 50 of the report, your report, you say you do not support Forest and Birds request to amend objectives sub 05 to include reference to climate and unnecessary section 6H and 106 of the Act related to significant risks. So that the identification of natural hazards also includes the likely effects of climate change. And this is just, I haven't drawn any conclusion or view about this, but section 7 does refer to the effects of climate change. Obviously climate change will have a greater effect on some natural hazards than others. So I'm just wondering whether, maybe there should be some scope for addressing climate change and the sort of exacerbation of some natural hazards because of it. Yeah.
Potentially, I'd have to
Okay.
I can address that more.
Now, on page 67 of your report, in reference to sub policy 10, you make some recommendations around amending that policy in line with the submissions going or legal council. And this is just a language question, really. But there's two things. One is it's sort of got fairly clunky now with the amendments, and I'm just wondering if to improve that. But more importantly, I'm just wondering whether the terminology consistent with the zone is clear enough to provide or further develop pedestrian, cycling and amenity linkages between the subdivisions and the surrounding areas where it's consistent with the zone. And I'm just wondering, is that clear what consistent with the zone means in terms of pedestrian, cycling and amenity to that? You kind of meaning like urban facilities if it's an urban zone?
I'm just meaning the objectives and policies of the zone.
Right. I'll just leave that question. Over the page about the network utilities policy. I think I answered myself on that question. Jumping ahead to page 96 of your report. And this you say that there's been no national policy statement on indigenous biodiversity that's been notified, and I accept that there's no formal one that's been introduced yet. But the exposure draft was released a little while ago now, a couple of months ago at least. Can you just provide some advice to us again? I know we covered this topic earlier on hearing number 1, I think it was, but do you think do we have the scope, or should we be looking at the exposure draft in any sense? We think about consideration for the plan.
It doesn't have any form of status, so it could only be. There's a question of how much weight.
I think the issue for us and for the council will really be that the current indication is that it will come into effect later this year, and it'll probably come at a time when we're trying to finish our recommendations to the council and what have you there. And so we will, it depends what it will say specifically in terms of giving effect to it, but I'm just sort of bookmarking that as a potential issue for us to address a bit later on through the process. So I'm wondering if having no consideration is a risk for us in terms of.
Well, I think I've just sort of made that statement, but in terms of the SNAs, I know that has definitely been taken into account in the preparation of those. So in terms of the subdivision chapter, it really relies on the natural environment chapter and, ensuring consistency with that. So I think from a subdivision chapter perspective, it's not such an issue. It's more sits with that natural environment SNAs provisions.
Thank you. And jumping ahead a little bit, page 128. You rounding off the question of building platforms. You say that in your opinion, there's no need to include a definition of building platform in the proposed plan as it's sufficiently clear what must be provided for. And I'm just wondering that because building platforms isn't in the national planning standards, it's a set definition. And it is a term, a technical term that the plan uses. And I'm just wondering, it may be clear to most people what it means, but and in practice it may be clear, but I am wondering why you're not recommending a definition for it, given that it's a sort of set term. And I'm thinking more of the risk that people will try and play with the rule in terms of skewing plans and things and do the minimum necessary or do silly things like building platform, that silly angle and things like that. And I'm just wondering whether what the reasoning is for not having a definition in the plan.
Well, my advice was that I consider that the standard itself is detailed enough to not require a definition. Because the thing you want to avoid with the definition is having that much detail in it that it should be in the standard. So, if you're going to set specific parameters like the 30 by 30 meters, that in my opinion is more of a standard than a description of what it is. So I suppose the question I have in my mind is what benefit would there be in having a definition of building platform when it's pretty specific to that standard anyway.
Thank you.
I think it's a matter of, it could potentially be quite basic definition included if the panel wished, perhaps more along the lines of the proposed Wharewa district plan. It's quite straightforward.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, mine relate to key 9.318 to 21 that around policy sub P6, where you are suggesting to add telecommunications network and power supply network. The initial question is related to P7 after you add this to P6. P7 is about to ensure where sites are not connected to a public water supply, etc., then an alternative must be found. Would we then have to amend P7 to do the same with power and telecommunication? And if not, will I have them in P6 to start with?
Well, if they're not available, then you can't really provide them. You can't really require an alternative. You don't have access to telecommunications or power supply. Then it would be. And I'm not sure about scope to add that either. I'd have to just check that. Get submissions a little more closely. So I'm not sure if I have scope to do that.
I would be interested in if you think you have scope, because I think to be added, I believe to maybe to be added to P6, then it has to be considered under P7. My other question related, I haven't quite got this formulated properly in my head, I apologise. So if someone was able to have satellite internet or a mobile phone coverage, would they then be, how does that work with P6?
Well,
Is that a telecommunications supply if they've got a mobile phone in their hand?
yes. Well, yes, telecommunications network. It's more. Yeah. Because the submissions were concerned about, if you haven't got access to a mobile phone service, for example, then how could you require someone to have that? Unless, I don't know, they had to put up some sort of transmission or something like that. So I think that's sort of really where the limitation comes in. But yeah, I'll have to give that, I'll have to go back to the submissions and just give that some further thought.
Can just following on the question of scope, one question I didn't ask you, in the evidence of Tom Anderson for the telecom providers, he raised the question of scope about making a deletion in objective sub 04.
Yeah, so that was sort of the first thing I spoke about earlier this morning. So I agree with him.
No
There
scope.
wasn't scope, so those words should be retained.
Thank you. Questions from the panel? Okay.
I was planning on attaching it to writing because I have gone into this. I have.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Janine. The responses there. We'll hand over to Rowena to her report. And in particular, we were very keen to get your response to points made by submitters in their evidence. Hand it over to you.
Good morning, I am Rowena MacDonald. I'm the reporting officer for the Section 42A reports for the contaminated land and hazardous substances, the earthworks and mining, and the natural hazards topics. I have read through and considered all the evidence and legal submissions provided to the panel prior to the hearing. There are a small number of matters across these topics that are remaining in discussion, and I'd like to address those. So let's start with the contaminated land and hazardous substances. And I wonder whether you may wish to ask me questions after each set, or would you like to ask questions at the end?
Probably after each set, I think.
There are two sort of matters of contention remaining in relation to the substances provisions. The first is around the definition of major hazardous facility. And in response to the evidence from Port New Zealand and the oil companies, I am considering some changes to the definition to further clarify around the incidental storage of hazardous waste where it's awaiting disposal, so that it doesn't inadvertently capture those things. So I'm just contemplating that, and I will come back on my right of reply with that, but I do acknowledge that there is some tension there. In terms of rule HZSR1, which is the handling, storage, handling or use of hazardous substances, except for major hazardous facilities. Having considered the evidence of generated farmers and First Gas, I have not changed my position, and I do not consider this permitted activity rule unduly regulates those substances. It merely provides a consenting pathway where the activity involves the use of explosives within 60 metres of any part of the gas transmission network. My recommendation was to remove the reference to the standards. And I think that also enables differentiation between storage, handling and use of hazardous substances in a major hazardous facility versus non-major hazardous facility. And that was all I have to say on that particular topic. If you have any questions.
Okay, I just had one question now, and picked up on the point that you're looking at making changes to the incidental storage. Because I was going to ask you, is it a question of quantities, or what, in your view? I know you may still be thinking about this next.
I have got some preliminary thinking about where I might land. Sorry to let you answer.
No, I'll be interested in, because I read those points and I was thinking, sounds like a question of quantity, but then when you stop and start on that particular aspect. So if you've had some thoughts, I'd be interested, and I won't hold you to them.
Yes, so one of the thoughts I had was to retain the clause that that's in contention, but to perhaps look at including some clarification wording in part B of the definition, so that when we talk about the incidental storage in any of those clauses, there's 3 times that comes up, that in brackets we would have maybe including for disposal. And I think that would provide some clarification around the incidental storage, including where it's being held for disposal, and that may just take away that, but that's just where I'm thinking at the moment. But I think it's useful to have a hazardous waste clause in there. I think that's quite a relevant point, because if you're storing a lot of hazardous waste and it's not just incidental, you're storing a lot, then I think that's considering as a main.
Yeah, I can imagine a situation where you can get out of control and you had a lot of hazardous substances being stored, possibly not in very good conditions because it's just a temporary thing eventually you'll get rid of. But I could also see the point that there could be lots of instances where there's a very small amount and it's not, even if it did go to pond, it wouldn't have too significant effect. So I can, the magic threshold there somewhere.
Yes, exactly. And I think my concern around quantities is that we set that.
Yeah.
So I was trying to think of a way that we could utilise the wording of the definition as it is, but make sure that it doesn't actually capture what we don't want it to capture.
Yeah. Thank you. As I said, I won't hold you to thinking about to change your views. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah.
Is this subject?
So I had one, page 21, 5.3.31. You said using a similar approach to Hastings District Plan. Inside of those, reading. Says similar approach to Hastings, but they do address hazardous substances over the Hiratonga Plains unconfined aquifer. So how does that equate, if at all, to the Ruataniwha Plains aquifer?
My understanding that the Ruataniwha isn't unconfined aquifer.
I have a lack of knowledge of what confined and unconfined aquifer means, obviously.
So with the Hiratonga Plains, it's a gravel lens. Janine might know a better way of explaining it. So when things go through it goes straight through the gravel and it ends up in the ground in the aquifer, whereas capped, I guess, would be another way of calling aquifers. They've got like a layer that protects them from what's infiltrating through from the top. Yeah.
So we wouldn't need to go as strong on protecting that aquifer because the actual ground does it for us.
That's kind of capped. Yeah, that's my understanding.
That makes sense.
Yes, thank you. And not the whole Hiratonga Plains is unconfined. Yeah.
Thank
So it's quite a unique aquifer.
Thank you.
you.
I think we're okay to move to the next report.
So easy, I'm done. Okay, so the next topic I will address is earthworks and mining. So there's a few matters in here that I would like to address. The first is amendments to policy EWP2. And I'm really just stating, having considered the evidence of federated farmers, I've not changed my position, and I remain of the view that the amendments they seek here should be rejected. And I'm sorry, I haven't really got a lot of detail with my notes, so but it will come through in my right of reply. Rule EWR5 and standard EWS6, which are related to earthworks and ridge yard. So I've considered the evidence from federated farmers and from Transpower on this matter, and I'm generally comfortable with the amendments now offered by Transpower in this regard, which largely achieves the relief sought by federated farmers. Rule EWR6, which is around earthworks within 20 metres of the gas transmission network. Having considered the evidence of federated farmers and First Gas in that respect, I have not changed my position with regard to retention of standard and of the rule in the PUP. Set out in my section 42. The oil companies requested a new rule for land disturbance activities. I've considered their statement and I have not changed my position. I consider the additional examples of land disturbance activities provided by them would still likely comply with the permitted activity conditions and standards applying to earthworks. Therefore, I remain of the view that a new rule for land disturbance activities isn't warranted, but I will come back and respond a bit further to that in my reply. The Kāinga Ora have requested a new rule relating to earthworks in the areas. I've considered the evidence of Mr. Campbell, and I've not changed my position in that regard. Mr. Campbell considers that it is unclear how the effects of permitted earthworks will be managed within areas of identified natural hazards, and that the proposed permitted earthworks could involve potentially significant earthquakes. The suggestion is that as a minimum, there should be a standard that earthworks not exacerbate the risks of any natural hazards, which in my view would necessitate a judgment call, which is not helpful in interpreting of rules and standards. So short of requiring resource consent for any and all earthworks within an area of identified natural hazard, I'm not clear as to how the relief sought by this matter could be achieved. And I remain of the view that the provisions of the Earthworks chapter sufficiently address issues around the effects of earthworks in relation to natural hazards, and that permitted earthworks are subject to compliance with the earthwork standards, including EWS1, which is related to slope, EWS3 relating to vertical extent, EWS4 around site reinstatement, and EWS5 around the control of silt and sediment. Otherwise, they are subject to resource consent requirement and the relevant assessment matters, which also refer to natural hazards. In terms of the specified earthworks permitted in Rule EWR1, these two are somewhat subject to constraints. And some of the earthwork standards, including standard S1 slope, and my recommendations in response to other submissions include amendments to this rule to require compliance with standards EWS4 site reinstatement and or EWS5 control of sediment, silt and sediment to some of these. So I think that will further enable protection around exacerbation of natural hazards. So now turning to ancillary rural earthworks, the definition. I note that Fed Farmers has requested clarification as to whether cultivation is an ancillary rural earthworks activity and whether that's permitted by the rules or whether it is unregulated. As I stated in the section 42A report, ancillary rural earthworks are a subset of earthworks, and cultivation is specifically excluded from the definition of earthworks as per the definition adopted under the standards. Therefore, cultivation is not regulated by the earthworks rules in the plan, including the rules and standards relating specifically to ancillary earthworks, such as standard EWS 2. I consider this as suitably evident and clear in the amendments I have recommended in respect of the definition. Federated Farmers also requested a new policy for ancillary rural earthworks. Again, I've not changed my position. I do not support inclusion of an additional policy, which was to provide for ancillary rural earthworks as unlimited, to recognise that they are normal and anticipated within the rural zones with de minimis effects, as sought by Federated Farmers, and remain of the view that such a policy is neither accurate, appropriate, or necessary. In response to the evidence from Port New Zealand, they've requested a new policy, a new enabling policy for earthworks. And I have considered that evidence, and I'm considering amending my recommendation to accept inclusion of an enabling policy, just to round out the earthworks policy. I think that's appropriate. That may also address some of the matters from the farmers from the previous submission. And that's really because the earthworks are an integral part of development, and that's part of the introduction to the chapter, and so that's sort of is appropriate, I think, to consider a policy in that regard. In response to the evidence from Heritage New Zealand around a request for a new standard for earthworks on the site of heritage items and sites in areas of significance to Māori, I am considering amending my recommendation in relation to inclusion of a new standard where it would effectively trigger consent for earthworks within sites containing wahitapu places on the historic heritage schedule and sites of significance in the SASM schedule. But I do wish to give this some further thought, however, because I'm just conscious of a crossover with the rules in the heritage chapter, the rules in the SASM chapter, and there's definitely earthworks provisions in the SASM chapter, and any overlap with the Historic Places Trust for archaeological sites, and just making sure that they all work in tandem. So I'll respond further in my form. I think my feeling is that in terms of SASMs, I think that's dealt with in the SASM chapter, but maybe Wahitapu Places Heritage chapter may not be covered, so there might be some in between there. And then finally on this matter, there is query about the policy EW9 around farm quarries. The evidence from Federated Farmers suggests that there is no scope to replace the wording policy from to enable to provide for. I disagree. I consider replacement of these words is within the scope of the Forest and Bird submission on this policy, which submitted that her enabled policy is not appropriate, particularly without reference to environmental limits. That should be deleted. Rather than delete the policy, my recommendation in the Section 42A report is to amend the wording to address the issues raised by Forest and Bird and change it from an enabling policy into a reference of remedying and mitigating effects. So I've not changed my position on that matter.
Are we open to questions? Mr. Lovell?
One, paragraph 3.2. 3.2. Just in reference to policy EW7. Heritage New Zealand have asked for just a consistency with terminology. From culturally sensitive sites to heritage items and sites of areas of significance to Māori. Yeah, those would be sites that are identified and mapped, or identified at least in terms of the schedules. Would that be right?
In my view, that it's not tied to the schedules.
Because that was my concern, is culturally sensitive sites and they're referring to. Yeah, you know, I want to understand if there was a risk that we would miss something, that there'd be a gap that make things damage. So it's been on.
Thank you.
Commissioner Levels probably asked a question I was going to ask around sites and significance and the definition around that. Waitapu and those sites I get, but do we need a definition, and do you have a definition of what a significant site is to Maori or to anyone?
I probably wouldn't feel that it was my place to be able to define that. I think there's probably so many different variations of what could be that to define it would be possibly constraining. It can be for all sorts of reasons why that area might be culturally significant. So I don't believe there's a definition in the national planning standards around it.
So perhaps it's a good opportunity to sort of unpick that policy. So probably from your point, so if we practically talk about an example, someone wants to do some earthworks near a site that's identified, then this picks it up. Someone identified, if someone does some earthworks and a site is identified, that's where we need to mitigate it. They wouldn't be able to avoid it because they've already done. This is that how we do it. You can't expect a farmer who doesn't know that there's a lighty tuppy there because we haven't got an atmosphere like that, who thinks that they're okay to dig and then they find a tuppy. How does that policy work? So that's when we get to the remedy.
Yeah, I guess if it was in an archaeological sense, like it was a site that was a physical site, then there's probably Heritage Act processes.
They get pointed in a particular direction.
And kind of there's been that discussion around accidental discovery protocols and things like that, which I think is kind of maybe that's, but yeah, certainly there's also areas that aren't physical. Again, which you may not know about until you've done something.
I think I will ask some of those questions later on today.
Just understand.
With a question.
Yeah, I have a slight request and then perhaps a question. I missed the second, you talked about the Federated Farmers Amendments being rejected, Earthworks P2 right at the start of your, and then you went on to gas, but there was something in between that, the transmission. Could you please read this?
Around earthworks in the National Grid Yard?
Yes.
Okay, so Federated Farm, so there's references around how far you can get, how close you can get to the national grid, basically, in terms of your earthworks. Federated Farmers made submissions requesting that that be, that you can find them related to that. I think it's the practice. And Transpower opposed it, but they've come back in their evidence and said this is no with that, and they've offered something which is actually quite similar, I think, to what Federated Farmers originally requested. So there's kind of like a meeting of the minds on that, and I'm comfortable with it.
My question that I had written down, because I got very confused over whether cultivation was allowed or not allowed or excluded, or I think you've actually I think it's in my head now. You're allowed to cultivate, yes? Yes. So how does that work with damn it, I had another question written down about that. How does that work with if you're allowed to cultivate within the national grid? What part of the plan do users go to if they are, or what controls them from planting something that requires a combine harvester to go under transmission lines? That's kind of the question I want to ask. I'm not quite sure what I'm after.
I guess. Are you asking,
Are there,
given that cultivation is not regulated through the Earthworks provisions, what protection for the national grid?
lovely question.
That what you asked?
Yes, that's pretty much it.
That's a good question. I guess that's maybe where their agreements come into play that they have with the landowners, maybe. I would have to.
Oh, okay, I'll ask them later.
That's a
Okay,
good
thank you.
question.
I'll write down your question.
Maybe the easement.
Thanks for saying.
I've just got a couple of questions. I'm just aware of time as well. On page 49 of your topic, you're recommending adding the words in brackets, including ancillary rural earthworks. EW 6 as a minor clause 16. Could you just explain to me, because I get very nervous about using clause 16 when it's not a spelling error or something like that. Can you explain to me why you think it's a minor amendment when it will have no implications for anybody? Any submitters?
I think I was looking to include that because I think it was clarifying as opposed to adding something. So because ancillary rural earthworks are a subset of earthworks, I thought it was okay to add including ancillary rural earthworks as a clarification more to, given that there seemed to be some confusion with federated funds.
So basically you're expanding on the definition or clarifying the definition includes ancillary.
Yeah.
You're throwing in as an extra.
Correct.
Just turning to page 66 and about aggregate and quality association around management. The comment, it's my understanding that offsetting is a last resort. In my experience, it's compensation is the last resort. You can't, if there's no offsetting available, it's not always possible to avoid remedy and mitigate quarry. You may be taking it away and you just can't mitigate that. So you look at offsetting and say, what do you do something? I think I'm asking the question whether the clarification that they're seeking could be possible, because I mean, section 104 and the equivalent for designations allows for offsetting and compensation to be fulfilled by applicants. You think that should be clear in the objective, or I haven't come to a conclusion, as you can see. I'm still thinking out loud around this.
So the objective at the moment is to ensure that the life supporting capacity, air, water, soil and ecosystems are safeguarded and the adverse effects of mining, quarrying and hydrocarbon extraction activities on the environment are avoided, remedied and mitigated. I'm not sure whether I don't know if I feel we need to expand that to offsetting. Is it something that can be considered in terms of but
this is a clarification for me. On the next page, paragraph number 315, we propose some recommended changes to objective O2. The forest quarrying is in there as well. Provide for them. Does the district plan actually provide for it? I mean, I'm just trying to at least that relationship between the NES for plantation forestry and the plan. Does their plan actually provide for forest quarrying activities outside the NES?
Well, I think it's the NES, the only provision that's particular to forestry quarrying. I don't think there's any provisions necessarily in PDP. I think it's maybe it's more if you were assessing resource consent that involved forestry quarrying. Wood.
Thank you. And all my questions on that. Any other follow-up questions? The final topic was
Natural hazards won't change.
okay.
So really the only really only short note that I have in relation to this topic is about flood hazard area mapping. So I've considered the legal submissions and evidence of Kaingora and evidence of the regional council on this matter. And I've not changed my position. I think that the PDP adopts the flood hazard overlay as the trigger by which to apply a risk-based set of rules to buildings and activities at risk of natural hazards. And I think that's appropriate in terms of achieving the objectives of the plan and an effect in relation to river flood hazard incidents. I know kind of also seek deletion of those very rules as well. So they are looking to delete the maps and the rules associated with them, which I also do not support. Whilst I accept that the river flood information may be subject to change over time, I consider it would be possibly ultra vires to apply those natural hazard rules in the PDP to dynamic maps sitting outside the plan. I find that's an issue from a planning perspective, I think, and having something outside the plan that you have rules relating to. So I think they either have them both, or you have neither. Can't have like a mishmash, and I would recommend retention of both. Whether, in my view, such changes to flood hazard information may or may not always necessitate a plan change process. For instance, if the spatial extent of the updated hazard area reduces due to more accurate and better information over time, then the maps may be able to be altered without recourse through a full formal plan change if there's nobody negatively affected by that. I mean, that's just one option. And if they were to extend them further as a result of the information coming through that there's more areas, then I think a plan change process is appropriate in that situation. And I think that that's the right process to allow people to consider the impacts on them. I note that mapping of river flood hazard with associated rules is a tried and true method adopted in all the district plans in the Hawke's Bay, Hastings Bay, Pilwara and Central Hawke's Bay to date. With quite a change to and I also note Appendix B, this is in relation to the comment from the Bay Regional Council, who have an eye around some of the recommendations in the table in Appendix B. And that was just to let you know that I'll be correcting those in my right to apply. It's just an error. That's the end of my comments on that topic. Do you have any questions?
Thank you. Okay, come back. Commissioner Taylor?
I'm going back to the earthworks ancillary rural activities on the under this under this chapter though. NHP 5 that includes to control the activities that occur in areas of significant natural hazard risk, including earthworks, which according to the chapter we've just done now includes ancillary rural activity.
Ancillary rural.
Yes, earthworks, sorry. Federated Farmers wanted to delete earthworks from this, which you've said no to. How have we inadvertently made this a bigger issue than it needs to be under the natural hazards area by including rural ancillary rural earthworks in that subset? Because they're standard, their usual farming practices. So we're controlling those activities in these areas now.
This is in relation to
NHP 5.
Sorry.
To control the activities that can occur in areas of significant natural hazard risk, including earthworks.
So your question, tell me if I'm wrong, is because we have referenced ancillary rural earthworks in the rules of the Earthworks chapter, that the policy relating to earthworks in natural hazard areas captures ancillary rural earthworks. That
Yes, and should it?
yes, I do believe it should. Remembering that it doesn't capture cultivation.
Yeah, no, it's the other.
So if, and my recommendation in relation to policy P5 is actually to change the wording from to control to manage, or that.
Okay.
So it would still be appropriate if a consent was triggered for earthworks, including ancillary rural earthworks. If there was such an extent of it that it triggered a consent, which is only in certain areas because it's unlimited in most zones. That natural hazards is one of those matters that we need to be considering.
I think went on to my next bit where 6.3.4 riparian planting and some drainage would be permitted activities in any other section of the PDP, but not whether they're to do with flood damage mitigation or not.
You make to that section again, what's it?
6.3.4.
It's in relation to rural NHR1.
Federated farmers have submitted that riparian planting and drainage should be reasonable activities for farmers to do on their land to mitigate potential flood damage. I'm saying this riparian planting and some drainage would be permitted activities in any other area of the plan. Is that rule too restricted?
Rule one is for is relating to natural hazard mitigation activities within the natural hazard area. And it's a permitted activity where it's carried out on behalf of.
I'll just hold that question if you would. I think I've got confused with. I think I'm confusing myself, so I'll just have a further think about what that. Because what I've written down here doesn't match with what I'm seeing there, so I actually think I've made a mistake in the transferring of my questions.
It's clarified during the day.
Yeah.
We ask it.
One.
Then
Yeah, I did. Finally. And the only clarifications. Were anything else. So if we go to paragraph 7.3.4. On page 52. And few times are talking about and then there's going to be the council pay for site-specific investigations, etc. Do you have a sense of the cost of doing something like that? So you can find out just that.
I don't personally. I think there is possibly a tension around that because it can be expensive.
Somebody can.
I mean, I think, I guess the only thing I can think around that is that, a lot of the hazard information, it's an ongoing research project, mostly done by the regional council with the support of the district councils in this region, and it is slowly but surely getting more accurate and better every day. But it's a big task. So I guess when it comes to a site specific situation, that does fall on the landowner.
8.3.2. So on page 58. And I just wanted to get a sense we can give me an understanding of the difference between the building code and the MEP table and what other council use.
So, the building importance categories. The clause A3 is, these are all in appendix C to my report attached there. So clause A3 of the building code is the first document in appendix C. And so that has quite a wordy approach to building performance levels. The NFE table is taken from their planning for the land on guideline. Second document. And I think that there is an attempt there to put the building importance levels into a planning type of framework, and then we have further developed that for this plan. I'm not sure what other plans have done that approach. Yes.
Thank you. I've only just got a couple of questions. The point around the virus of having flood maps outside and inside is a good one, but I do understand the Auckland Unitary Plan does that approach. It rules for flood hazards. I know it has maps outside the plans.
I'm not sure of the rules relating to that.
It's a question I may save for time.
And I think they've given us 2 examples. Yeah.
Okay, on page 26 of this report, it's around policy P5 in response to fed farmers, they were seeking changes around habitable buildings. We comment on the non-habitable buildings. We don't comment on the earth side of. Can you maybe just now sort of comment on that? So in paragraph 5.3.18, you say you don't support deleting or making changes around habitable buildings and deleting the. Your recommendation follows through on that, but why not delete earthworks from farmers?
My reasoning here. Is that earthworks can also cause property damage and impact on health and safety of people. They're not managed. So to delete that from the policy. I think they are appropriate in that policy. As they can cause issues around risk from natural hazards. I guess just something off the top of my head, one example may be when there's been a large event and earthworks have created a less than stable hillside, and then it dumps down into the river and then causes damage further down, I guess. One example.
Thank you. No, that's all the questions I have. Any further questions from the panel? Yes.
I'm still concerned about that 6.3.4, the back to the, so federated farmers, if landowners were to do natural hazard mitigation activities on a stopback on a creek on their farm in one of these areas, or the planting of willows in a particular gully to stop, for flood control measures, or to, if they're on a fault zone, fault avoidance area, the planting of that to stabilize soil in those areas, then that is not a permitted activity according to NHR 1, because they are not a local authority, network utility operator, or requiring authority. And yet those activities would be permitted under all other sections of the plan, but they're not in these specific mapped areas. Is that correct?
I guess there's a slight nuance to that in that if they're carrying it out on behalf of a local authority or
Landowner on their land.
or under duties under the soil conservation rule, those kinds of things can be permitted.
No, a landowner doing something on their land, on a river or a creek that runs on their land, and they happen to be in a fault avoidance area or flood hazard area.
I guess the only thing I can think of in that situation is if it's for natural hazard mitigation purposes, then if it's not being done under the local authority or the network lead, and it's not under those kind of reasons, then we might want to actually have some scrutiny that maybe for the regional council plan. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Oh, yeah, true. There's a there is a setback from all streams, rivers in terms of activities on the regional plan. I can check.
Because that strikes me as being too not permissive enough, or for that sort of I completely understand that if you're going to change I'm thinking in terms about my own creek, when we wanted to change the angle of it so it stopped eating away the land, we did have to get the regional council in type thing, but we are currently planting said riverbank with no,
It seems counterintuitive.
I don't know if it captures, if that rule would capture vegetation.
well, according to natural hazard mitigation activities, the definition includes.
Planting.
One of the questions I have on feed farmers is sort of the on the other side of the coin. So if we don't enable it, is there a risk that we will lose the opportunity of farmers doing the good work of actually planting, working in unison, in effect, with the council in terms of funds, because they'll have to go through all the process of getting approval to do something that I think is a good thing to do, and it seems very counterintuitive.
Obviously, we're not talking the Tuki Tuki River or the Waipawa River. We're talking ones that actually run through, smaller ones that run through on a landowner's property, as opposed to the big ones that where the stop banks and the planting and everything is controlled by the regional council.
Yes, I guess that would be the rub of us, if you wanted to allow that, you probably have to have a specific, like a rule that is very specific to that. I probably wouldn't be in that role, it would have its own role, which, you know, there's possibly scope to do that.
Or the landowner says, I'm planting it for aesthetic purposes because I want the kererus to land and eat the seeds, rather than the fact that that particular tree might be hazard mitigation activity. It just seems,
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think possibly the definition, natural hazard mitigation activity is supposed to be addressing things like, putting in trees to stabilize. And it's usually in response to some soil erosion matters. And often regional council will have been involved or whatever, but.
That, there doesn't seem to be any restriction on planting. In the riparian areas of rivers. There is a rule 76 of the Hawke's Bay Regional Resource Management Plan that talks about provides for the introduction or planting of any plant or any part of any plant in, on, or under the bed of a lake or river, except as provided for by Rule 1771. So that obviously that's within the confines of the actual river,
Yeah.
or which part of the river. And the only other thing that really the plan controls is the clearance of vegetation in rivers. So I don't think it would be captured. What can we sit on the unpronounced?
Yes, if it's not for natural hazard mitigation purposes.
how can you prove that and who's going to look at it?
There is another rule, Rule 70, which is structures, and that's as Rowan talks about where it's to do with the Soil Conservation and Rivers Control Act, Local Government Act in relation to planting. So that's more specific. So the first rule I refer to not prevent where it's to do with the river outside of the flood control unit. What
No, it raises an interesting.
that's limited to carrying out.
Maybe that's something you could ponder about and come back to us. Yeah, with their
So we can come back to that. There is another one there about planting within 6 meters. If it's within a flood control scheme, which is discretionary.
We're at the time. I propose to adjourn the hearing for 15 minutes because we'll need that time. Refreshments, etc. I am aware that we are due to have telecoms on 10:30, and I can see that Graham and Tom are online. So we will probably return about 22:11. And have Tom talk to his evidence. And after that, we have a short block of time for questions as well. Yes, we have. Okay, so I'll adjourn the hearing and we'll resume at 10:40. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Hearing stream number 5 will reconvene. We've had responses from the reporting planners to submitted evidence and questions from the panel, and we'll turn now to Graham McCarrison and Tom Anderson on behalf of Spark, Chorus, and Vodafone. Now, Tom, we've read your evidence, and I don't know if you heard the initial point of the reporting planners because of our technical glitch right at the beginning of the hearing, but they've accepted your point around scope for deleting network utilities. So just to let you know, that's been resolved. And we have read your evidence. Thank you very much. But if you would like to highlight any points in your statements or respond to anything you've heard this morning, we appreciate that. So it's over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one other point as well.
Can't hear you, Graham. Tom. You unmuted, but we can't hear you. So hang on, Tom.
Can you hear me now? You hear me now?
I can hear you.
You can hear me?
hear us? Just shake.
Yeah. Can you hear us? Yep. Graham, can you hear
Yep.
us?
Yep.
It's just,
And
yes.
I can. Can you hear Graham? Graham, Graham, can you check if the
Yep.
panel can
Hi.
hear you?
Yeah, can you hear me? No.
So I'm just going to put in the chat.
Yeah.
I'm just getting IT.
All right.
Coming. Might be long.
You think by now.
No, it will work one moment and not the next.
Just checking you can hear us now.
All right. Tom, could you say a word or two just to test it?
Kia ora, everybody. Can you hear me now? I take it from Robert's head shake that that's a no.
I got.
Okay. Oh,
Hey.
and Graham, can you?
Yay.
Graham, was your comment a bugger? That was the first one.
Timing,
Heard.
eh?
Oh, these communications, I don't know.
Absolutely.
Okay, so over to you, Tom, without.
Yeah. Thank you for your introduction, Mr. Schofield. And one other the person online is Colin Clune, who is from Vodafone and produced evidence as part of part of the submissions that the telecommunications companies put together. So just drawing your attention to that. I heard most of this morning's presentations from the 42A officer, and I noted the issue around scope there, which was just a point I wish to highlight in my evidence. So yeah, thank you for clarifying that matter. I guess generally there's really good alignment between the 42A officer's recommendations and where I sit on the issues at hand. The one to draw your attention to is the definition for regionally significant infrastructure, which I discuss it, I think it's around paragraphs 29 onwards of my evidence, and that the term strategic telecommunications and radio communications facilities is problematic. The reason being that strategic telecommunications and radio communications facilities is undefined and the network operates as a whole. So yeah, seeking that the term strategic be deleted from that provision or that definition. The other matter which I heard some discussion around this morning was concerning policy 6 and policy 7. So we submitted on policy 6 and not on policy 7, and part of the reason for that is we considered policy 6 to be comprehensive, a comprehensive policy that established or is to ensure a telecommunications connection, and as part of that sets up a framework for any subdivision applicant and the council to discuss what the alternatives could be should there not be an ability to connect to a telecommunications network, and also noting that the technology that provides telecommunications is fast evolving. Currently it's driven by fibre and cellular networks, but also we have things like Starlink and other satellite-driven companies being able to provide that. In addition, there is also the radio rural connectivity group who have provided additional wireless connectivity in rural areas of Central Hawke's Bay. But essentially we're trying to set up a framework there where if a telecommunications connection is not present at the time of subdivision, then there is an ability for a consent notice to be applied on a newly established title to make future occupiers aware that connectivity does not exist. Other than that, Graham or Colin, have you got anything you'd like to add? Graham, I think you're on mute now too.
Well, I think the muting is on our side. So,
Okay,
I know you got to
Yep.
unmute.
Colin.
Yep.
Yeah,
Okay,
there we go.
done. So yeah, as Tom has just set out, the idea of this is that at the time of subdivision, there should be a requirement on the applicant to establish that there is or isn't connectivity. Our industry is expanding connectivity across particularly rural areas, as this council will have noticed over the last few years, as Tom set out with Rural Connectivity Group, but also the initiatives of Vodafone, 2 Degrees, Spark, but also in the fibre space of Chorus as well, around small urban villages and so forth to expand out. So whether there's connectivity today might change within the next year or 5 years. Plus also we've got an ever expanding network of satellites, Starlink being the biggest network, and there's others that will come into the market at some point. And these networks sort of work either directly into particularly rural areas or via other networks like our ones as well going forward. So we don't think it's an onerous thing. An applicant would then practically should come to like Spark or Vodafone and go, is their network available at the time of subdivision? And we can issue on letterhead that there is or isn't. It's just relying on the coverage plans. Electronic ones don't necessarily tell an applicant or the public or council whether a location is actually in stop sell. So the site doesn't have capacity to actually sell further plans, because we'd then break some Fair Trading Commerce Commission infringements at that point. So practical, but just that's, yeah.
Thank you, Graham. Shall I open up to questions from the panel? Commissioner Taylor.
I just need to find what I'm
Okay, Commissioner.
asking.
You just around the connectivity on subdivisions and that. So what you're saying is that anyone doing a subdivision needs to make sure that people are connected. If they're unconnected, like a lot of us are unconnected, in the rural area, is that on the subdivider or the developer to make sure that they get, say, cellular towers put up next to it so it works? Was it going to be on Telecom, Vodafone, I'm sorry, Spark or Vodafone or whoever? How's that work?
I like the question. We would say it's not on us to build a very expensive cell site for one small subdivision. If it was a massive subdivision, 100 lots, well, in terms of dwellings and so forth, we'd definitely look at doing that. So it is horses for courses, but at the moment, we have a national copper network that does go down all roads into all properties currently. And if there is no capacity within the wireless mobile networks, which, as I said earlier, is changing all the time, then a copper connection potentially will be an option from Chorus, because we would generally like to provide a connection. But if it was in the extreme case that there was no connection, then the council and the applicant need to think about, is that appropriate? But the key thing for us is that the people purchasing it know what network, what utilities are available, and if no telecommunications are available, so therefore Starlink or a satellite provider doesn't have capacity in their satellite, which is currently the situation with Starlink, till they launch a whole new array of satellites, which is soon potentially. But technology is changing in that field as well. So it potentially comes down to a decision point as to what's appropriate and therefore what the future landowners are sold. And it might change the price and value of the subdivision.
Just on the next question, do you have any idea how many people are dropping copper as we speak for just cellular? And percentage of people moving away from landlines?
The move is, it depends from area to area. So in some parts, for example, Vodafone has indicated to customers that they're moving out of copper connections. Spark has not gone down that path yet. So people still have a choice. Under the Commerce Commission, we have an obligation not to leave people with no option. So this is existing customers, not new customers. So there is a transfer onto wireless, but if there's no wireless connection or satellite connection, then people are forced to stay with copper. And to be fair, copper and wireless connections are a lot better. So hence the reason for moving customers off. And so each of our networks go, well, we've got capacity to move people out of it, so we'll promote that service. But if we don't, then we won't. So. But yeah, it's big numbers. I just don't have the actual number. So I can get it if you would like. So.
Shaking his head is a no. Thank you, Graham. Commissioner Lovell.
I just had a just a thing that was just help in terms of application. I know that the reporting officer has suggested that she be an agreement to remove the strategic communications.
Excuse me, Commissioner Lovell, sorry for interrupting, but it's really difficult to hear you. So I've missed most of that, unfortunately.
Okay, so if we go to paragraph 32 of your evidence. Tom,
Yes,
I was just saying, I note our planner has is of a mind to remove the word strategic from the line of telecommunications and radio communication facilities. So in line with your suggestion, just on paragraph 32, you note about plan review processes, and you've identified a few. And
yes.
then you've just said each time the companies have submitted on the matter, and in each case, amendments have been made. Did all of those councils seek to include strategic, or were they various other?
It was primarily around the term, around the term strategic. And Marlborough, Porirua, Hutt City and Auckland removed theirs as part of the hearings. Greater Wellington have a plan change, which is in their RPS, a proposed change to the RPS out now where they've amended the definition and removed the term strategic.
No, but thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. So.
No worries.
Well, just to follow up on that, just one question. I understand, that it's a question of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts in terms of telecommunication networks, but the policy itself, P17, talks about to ensure, to the extent practicable, subdivision design that takes into account the location of regionally significant infrastructure. Does that have any implications, given that sort of the width of the meaning of telecommunications and radio communications facilities for subdivision, or not really in practice?
Not particularly in practice. It's more around built environment subdivision, built environment effects in terms of reverse sensitivity, rather than subdivision effects for telecommunications. And that relates to building heights and their ability to block existing signals. But I think that's a matter we will deal with in the network utilities chapter.
Thank you. It's understood. Any other questions?
Yeah. With regards Tom, it's Kate Taylor here.
Hello.
The words to ensure there is or isn't a connection. So is that under P6, is that what you are suggesting is that there is a letter that goes with the consent that says there is no connection available in this area, full stop. That's your part in the process?
That's right. That's what the part the telecommunications companies would play. And that then establishes the ability for something akin to a consent notice or any other vehicle available to ensure that any prospective purchaser of the newly created allotment was aware that there was no telecommunications connection or any other utility connection.
In regard to a fibre optic cable or a copper line?
Or a wireless connection. So telecommunication connection, in my view, takes in wireless or wired, and wired being copper or fibre.
So an ANET or that sort of thing that would still come under that, regardless of who they're getting that wireless service from. Farms,
that's right. Yes.
So that would be covered in that letter.
That's right.
And to go a step sideways then in regards power, which I know is not your point, but if you think the telecommunications are so important in this, hang on, I'm just formulating the question in my head as I speak out loud.
Sure.
Again. Do you have an opinion on whether power should be included in this alongside telecommunications?
I wouldn't call myself an expert in terms of power supply. I've been working with telecommunications companies for a long time and never really worked with power. But in my view, it's a whole of utilities approach. So as is covered in the policy already, we've got power supply and 3 waters as well as telecommunications. So I think it should be included on that holistic basis.
So wouldn't we would another option there just be to have network utilities? Not
Yes.
telecommunications and power?
Yes, but if you go back to the definition of network utilities in the plan, I haven't got it in front of me now, but typically it's referencing back to section
Very wide.
166 of the Act, and it's incredibly wide, including things like roads, rail networks. So I think it's appropriate, therefore, for policy 6 to be more specific than just reference network utilities as a whole.
So to take the step I was taking before with policy 7, if telecommunications and power are so integral to the success of a subdivision or important to living, why would they not then, what's your opinion on whether they should then be put into P7?
Well, I think with P6, we took it as I said earlier, as that being that comprehensive approach where it sets up the framework for the discussions to happen with telecommunication providers, and that it becomes a judgment call for the planner as to whether the intended use of whatever the new lot may be, which it might be irrelevant for it to have telecommunications, or it might be completely relevant, and that they set up that notification or information via a new title that a telecommunications connection is not possible. So I didn't see at the time policy 7 to be necessary for us to submit on because of the way I think in my mind policy 6 worked.
Do you think adding power to policy 6 is within scope?
I'm not sure if the power companies have submitted on policy 7, but in terms of
Policy 6, sorry.
okay, I think there was a comment from the 42A officer, correct me if I'm wrong, please, about power being included in that. It was up to, I think Transpower was indicated that they may wish to comment on that in their evidence, and I must confess I haven't read that evidence.
So I'm asking you if you have any objection to us.
I don't have any
Thoughts
objection.
are, rather, what your thoughts are on power being included.
No, as I said before, I think it should be holistic, and that include power supply alongside telecommunications in the three waters.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any questions? No, that's all the questions. Thank you very much for your time and patience with our IT here and our questions. So thank you very much. I'll let you get on with your day.
Thank
No
you very
problem.
much.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Cheers. Bye.
Thumbs up if you can hear me, Jordan and Lynette.
Yes, yes, can hear you.
We've overcome our earlier problems. Thank you for attending the hearing again. At least with Zoom, you can not have all that travel involved. So thank you. We've read your evidence that you've submitted to us. So we'd be very keen for you to talk to that. I will just say, I don't know that if you heard the comments, the initial comments, the opening comments from the reporting planners on matters this morning, but there was some agreement with your evidence in regard to certain matters. I'm just trying to find them at the moment. One was the issue around the temporary storage of hazardous substances and things. We were informed that she does see the point in evidence on that topic and will think about it and has some initial thoughts how to deal with the issues you've raised with that definition. That's the incidental storage question mark. Oh, yes, it's the enabling policy that you were seeking around earthworks. That we were told this morning that she sees the point in having a sort of an enabling policy around earthworks. And we'll provide some wording around that to us in written. Just to let you know that it may shorten your evidence this morning. So other than that, we're open to you to talk to your evidence and your submission. Who would like to go first?
I will kick off. Thank you very much for that introduction. We weren't able to catch that morning session, so that's been really useful. Just to give steer on that, which, like you say, I think will actually make our session pretty brief today. So I'll start off first, my statement being kind of more generally covering the topics, and then hand over to Lynette around the specifics on the major hazardous facility definitions. So as per my statement, I think there was generally pretty good alignment with the Section 42A report recommendations, and the main change that was sought there was around the enabling policy for earthworks, just to kind of round out that policy framework and kind of provide a bit of policy support around the framework itself, but generally happy with the rule framework. So that was really the only change sought in my statement of evidence, and as you just mentioned, it seems like there will be some wording coming out on that, so I might just actually leave it there and come back to the end with any questions and hand over to Lynette.
Thank you. Lynette?
So my statement of evidence was really just focused on the hazardous substance section, and in particular the addition to the major hazardous facility as a result of fire and emergency, where they've sought the inclusion of storage or treatment of hazardous waste, including reuse and recycling facilities or hazardous substances awaiting reuse, recycling or treatment. And my concern with that is because the definition of hazardous waste in the plan is very, very broad, that addition captures a huge amount of things that might be sitting waiting for disposal, but wouldn't trigger the threshold for a major hazardous facility under the health and safety and works regs. So we've got a real conflict between different regulations, really, if that addition is made as it is. Now, I noticed you said that there was some discussion about the temporary storage of hazardous substances. My question is, if you put into the rule, into the definition of major hazardous facility, any facility deemed a major hazardous facility under the Health and Safety and Work Major Hazardous Facilities Regulations 2016, do you actually really need to add the other clause? Because anything that would trigger those regs would be captured anyway if it was a hazardous waste. So it's about the duplication, really, and if we rely on those regs, I think that's a more appropriate addition in terms of what is a major hazardous facility. So that's just in brief what my concern is.
Okay, thank you, Lynette. I'm sure that point's been taken on board by the reporting planners. Just thinking on the fly around this, if a new definition or a refined definition around temporary or incidental storage is provided, I may consider the option of opening it up to responses from submitters, because it could raise all sorts of questions around the workability and effectiveness of that clause. So I may want to keep that conversation open if I consider it appropriate to. So just to let you know that. But
yeah. Would that involve would that involve a change to the definition of hazardous waste?
I'm not sure. I think the thinking is still out at the moment.
Right.
Topic. So just to let you know my initial thinking around this particular point. and the way forward.
Yeah, happy to be engaged.
Thank you. Were there any other matters in your?
No,
area?
that's the only matter that my evidence addressed. So,
Are you open to questions from the panel?
yes, certainly.
Okay, Commissioner Lovell? I can't go the other way. Go back to you.
The other way.
Yeah, no, you've covered all our points and questions, so thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Well, saying that, we'll let you get on with your day, and we will turn to the next submitter. So thank you very much for your time and patience.
Thank you.
Yes. Now, the next part of the hearing, I will recuse myself, as they say. Another one? Yes, please. So what we're going to do, we've got a little bit of numbers problem here today because one of our commissioners is unwell, can't attend. Therefore, I have to, and I also have to leave. So to make our quorum of 4, we need to bring in another commissioner who handily works just on the other side of the road. So I'll recuse myself right now and wait for her to attend, and the chairing will go over to Commissioner Lovell from this point.
So we're on our returns now.
Yep.
Obviously, the other person reserved it at night.
Okay,
To join on this.
we're running early for once, which is great. So.
It'll take Commissioner Byrne a couple of minutes to
No doubt.
Right.
pick up at work and cross the road.
Like this blank page there. That's where I had trans. Welcome. Welcome. Can you hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Oh. What am I talking? I think people quietly, so. So, welcome again to the Mr. Calculator. I'm just checking a few things that our reporting plan has discussed in terms of the transmission. Transparent submissions. But I think in the absence of having a list of specific comments, like in your submission, and take it as read. So therefore, if you want to give us the salient points, that would be helpful. And we'll take questions afterwards.
Thank you, thank you. So obviously my name is Pauline Whitney, I'm a planner of the school. And I've got Mr. Ben Cartwright, who's an engineer for Transpower, and online we have Daniel Hamilton, and he's the environmental team leader for Transpower. So really, I guess the main point today is we support the officer recommendations, and there's probably only really two, I'd say, requirements outlined in my evidence that we're seeking, just probably improvements rather than wholesale changes to the provisions. We just thought it was a good opportunity to come and present in person. We appeared at hearing 3 and we will be at hearing 7, just easier in person, we think. And then if you've got any wider questions about the grid and how it operates and engineering queries, we just thought it's good context. So if agreeable to the panel, we thought we would just provide a really brief overview. And we have provided some which we can provide. But there's nothing new or contained in our evidence. So I think for ease, we might have Mr. Hamilton go first, and then Mr. Cartwright, and then I'll just wrap up the end of the specs and outline the kind of the two requirements we suggest. I'm happy for questions during or after. Here's the panel. So I'll hand over to Mr. Hamilton.
Thanks, Pauline. Good morning, panel members. And firstly, thank you for letting me join this in digital form. I do appreciate that, and hopefully you can hear me okay. Yeah, my name is Daniel Hamilton, and I'm the Environmental Regulatory Team Leader at Transpower. So our team is split between Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch, and we have 3 primary roles, one of which is managing Transpower's NPS implementation program, which sees us engaging in planning processes the length and breadth of New Zealand, with the aim of getting provisions into plans to give effect to the NPS-ET. And to ensure to the greatest extent possible the safe and efficient operation, maintenance, upgrade and development of the grid is provided for. For this hearing, I'm adopting the evidence of Mr. Dougal Campbell, who presented at hearing 3. Unfortunately, he couldn't attend today. And as I said, thank you for letting me join this over the ether instead of being there in person today.
So unless there's any particular questions, I suggest we go to Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you all. Benjamin Roy Cartwright, employed by Transpower as a lines engineer within our technical engineering team. I'm just going to summarize some of my key points from my evidence dated the 17th of August. It's also expected, but I'm happy to take any questions on it, that my evidence from hearing stream 3 has been read and understood. That covered a lot of the basic components of the national grid, and I don't want to spend time reciting all of that when we don't have to. Two things I want to talk about. One of them is access. So a clear working space and good access is required, particularly around the base of structures, and in some cases under the conductors, to move plant and equipment and set it up quickly. And this is particularly in the case of an emergency. So Transpower must always be able to fix emergencies and find the fault. A lot of businesses and communities are heavily reliant on electricity, and any delays in restoring faults can have big consequences to the grid and to the wider public. In an ideal situation, Transpower would have unimpeded physical access to transmission line structures. But as we know throughout New Zealand, this is not always possible. There's streams, there's natural barriers, there's subdivisions. So on that, insensitive or sensitive development, they can constitute additional physical barriers to accessing transmission line support structures, which increase the cost, difficulties, and timeframes associated with gaining access to structures. And on that, excavated areas or piles of earthworks. So if we have a lot of earthworks of soil, they can restrict or change Transpower's access and mean that we have to, at emergency notices, locate heavy machinery in to get access to the structure. On earthworks, so Transpower seeks to control earthworks near the national grid. Earthworks adjacent to towers or poles can undermine the stability of the structure foundation, causing the structure to lean or worse, collapse. One of the reasons Transpower seeks to manage earthworks by third parties, which includes quarry and landfill operators, is to mitigate or at least significantly reduce the safety risks described above. If we have physical separation from transmission infrastructure, it greatly reduces the likelihood of harm or damage occurring to people or property. Touching on specifically earthwork Rule 5, and I'll leave Ms. Whitney to speak specifically on the planning rules. I will just say that I support Transpower's amendment of Earthworks Rule 5 to align with section 2.2.3 of NZECP 34. As this provision provides the necessary distance to reduce the risks of both an earth potential rise incident as well as future stability incidents. Transpower, as part of its regular maintenance program, has had several major incidents of soil movement compromising structures' strength and the reliability of the national grid. This has resulted in costly relocations and remedial strengthening. Residential activities. There are a range of residential activities that are sensitive to Transpower's assets. These sensitivities include electrical interference, which can have perceived health effects. Radio controlled and global positioning systems are also known to be affected by close proximity transmission lines. And also, as outlined in the evidence of Ms. Whitney, the NPSET provides specific reference to sensitive activities, which include residential activities. The main hazard associated with high voltage transmission lines is receiving an electrical shock, which cannot be mitigated from an engineering perspective. It can only be avoided. And two other points I just want to touch on are the National Grid Yard and the National Grid Corridor and NZECP 34. We're just going to touch on the National Grid Yard corridor first. The importance of the transmission corridors has been recognised by government policymakers. The NPSET, introduced in 2008, requires councils to give effect to its provisions in the plans they adopt under the RMA. The distance the transmission conductor swings in high winds is dependent on the ambient temperature, the power being carried, the wind speed, the type and size of the conductor, the tension it's strung at, the supporting pole configurations, and the length of the span. So we've adopted standard corridors around New Zealand that are based on the 95th percentile spans across the country to really define the national grid yards and the national grid corridors. NZDCP 34 serves an important purpose in prescribing minimum safe distances for the constructions of buildings and structures for the use of mobile plant and for excavation near transmission lines, structures and overhead lines. However, it does not address the wider third-party effects that compromise the national grid, which are managed by the NPSET. The minimum safety requirements in NZDCP 34 neither seek to protect the integrity of the national grids from the effects of third parties, nor prevent the development, including sensitive and insensitive development, from occurring directly underneath transmission lines. As discussed in my evidence, such development constrain operational maintenance activities on the line. While section 2.2.1 references setbacks for earthworks for poles, these are the minimum safe distances and they do not address access, maintenance, or potential compromising of support structures. Further, NZDCP 34 does not adequately account for the earth potential rise hazard contours. I'll hand over to Ms. Whitney.
Just to confirm right now that I've got the paperwork for you, Ms. Whitney, the planners this morning noted that with WR5 and 6, international they are generally comfortable. It's now offered by Transparent on that regard. Thank you. And the other I believe was assessment matter sub AM17 subdivisions with building reforms. What is considered your evidence in relation to requesting of the minor amendment that it refers to support structures. And that support was as it actually considered it unnecessary because the definition of the line that would be there's no pride is already sufficient to cover that. So if you have any comments on that. Right.
Maybe I can address those straight up. The start might be easier. Pleased to hear regarding supporting those amendments to Rule 5 in that standard S6. I think they do just improve the plan and the application of the rules. Regarding that AM17, completely agree it's addressed in the definition. So accept the officer's recommendation on that. I just thought it did provide some clarity, except it may not be necessary and you understand. I wish maybe not add unnecessary wording, it's not needed. Comfortable with that. So from Transpower's perspective, there's really no outstanding issues. Again, given the effects of activity, we should issue for Transpower, and it's something that needs to regulate and give effect to in district plans in terms of activities, earthworks and subdivision and the effect on the national grid. So the activities were addressed under hearing 3 and earthworks and subdivision, obviously this hearing. So we just thought it important to come and kind of wrap up the whole package of those provisions, given the importance of them to Transpower. So in terms of Transpower's submission on the PDP, it was largely in support, and I would phrase the amendments as rather refinements as opposed to wholesale changes. So the topics to hearing 5 were basically just the planned structure and location, natural hazards, subdivision and earthworks. The planned structure and location, this was addressed at hearing 3. And as I've outlined, I'm comfortable with the officer's recommendation on that and fully accept your plan, and you want to frame it how, and have it arranged how it works for you. So accepting that, as long as there's clear linkages between the provisions, Transpower's comfortable with the arrangement and the plan and the structure. With respect to the natural hazards, again, I support the officer recommendations. Really, they were just clarification of the application of some of the rules, and that has been provided. So Transpower again is supported and comfortable with the officer recommendations. The subdivision, probably one of the main changes sought through the submission was a change in the activity status for the subdivision within the National Grid subdivision corridor from controlled to restricted discretionary. We carefully considered this, and I looked at provisions across the country and so forth, and as outlined in my evidence, accept the controlled activity status on the basis of basically there's no existing assets within urban areas that all contained within the rural environment. the two standards there regarding access and stability and platforms, as long as they're attained and quite clear, Transpower's comfortable with the controlled activity status. Obviously, if those standards aren't met, you then trigger non-compliant. If that were to change, Transpower would have some concerns, but on the basis if it's retained, they're comfortable. And I guess one of the other main determining factors was the minimum lot size for rural subdivisions being 12 or 20, depending on the zoning. So I guess you've got quite a high threshold there for the lots created as well at the moment. So I think those three factors all contribute to Transpower accepting controlled activity status within Central Hawke's Bay. I mean, I think Transpower does like to seek a uniform approach across the country, but it also does recognise the circumstances and context. And I guess the other thing as well, given the location of the lines, they're not close to Waipukurau or Waipawa. We don't anticipate residential intensification, not like some areas where they're bordering. We can see both potentially going out that way. It's quite different given the context here. So again, the only other matter in terms of subdivision was the amendment to that assessment matter 17, and the officers supported that, so that's all agreeable. If I can just comment then about Earthworks, again, Transpower supported the officer's recommendation, and as I've outlined, I just saw one change or two changes to the Earthworks rule and standard. I note I reviewed all the other evidence of the other parties, and probably the only one that referenced the National Grid was Mr. Seed's evidence from Federated Farmers. Now, if I could just maybe make a couple of comments in response to that. So, the National Grid Yard Earthworks standards provide clear exceptions from the setback standards for earthworks, which are undertaken by a network utility operator, undertaken as part of agricultural, domestic cultivation, repair, sealing or resealing of a road, footpath, driveway or farm track, and vertical holes not exceeding 500 millimetres in diameter. For all other earthworks, the setback standards apply, as outlined in my evidence. As Mr. Cartwright's outlined, NZECP 34 is a code of practice, sets the minimum safety distance. It doesn't address the effects or regulate the effects on the national grid, and doesn't give effect to the NPSCT. It's the key point as well. It is a code. It's not a mandatory bottom line or anything like that. And there's nothing to restrict a district plan from being more restrictive than what's in the NZECP 34. Again, just noting that NZECP 34 only addresses certain issues and doesn't give the whole comprehensive package to ensure operation and maintenance of the national grid. This about fences in her evidence and when they were built and when the national grid support structures were built. So I am just aware that the line here was constructed in 1942. So it has been in existence in its fixed position. It would be better than that, but since that time, so fences may have changed, but the grid has pretty much stayed since 1942 in that same position. And in terms of my final point, so the Earthworks rule R5 does permit vertical holes not exceeding 500 millimetres in diameter, provided they're more than 1.5 metres from the hole. And this reflects clause 2.2 of NZECP 34. And fences are allowed to be 5 metres from a pole. And again, that reflects NZECP 34. So I guess the only main thing that I can see that's not reflecting NZECP 34 is that distance from the poles in terms of the 2.2 or the 6 metres. And again, Transpower seeks the 6 metres to reflect the wider issues in terms of the effects on earthworks on the national grid, and that NZECP 34 is not sufficient to address all those effects. And obviously anyone has the option of applying for consent. It's restricted discretionary. The merits and the actual effects and the safety issues can be addressed there. Thank you. So obviously welcome any questions, clarification.
No, I did, I've said I was going to ask it, so I will, but I think I've changed my thinking of it. With cultivation allowed under the transmission lines, how could the crop or whatever's under that is cultivated, the planting or the harvest of that is the actual machinery, even though the cultivation is allowed. Is there more there that could change the way that corridor reacts?
So one of my roles, Taylor, at Transpower is overseeing the technical aspects of our underclearance program. So that is where we potentially have issues like this. We've had a big dealing with, it's in a slightly different area, but like with pivot irrigators coming underneath our line. There's nothing in the legislation that says they cannot, but they can create big electrical hazards. We've worked where we discover them. We have a program of surveying our assets. We patrol our assets every year, and we fly over our assets every 7-ish years. And where we discover them, we work with the landowners to address the solution there. Whether that be in the pivot irrigators case, whether that's just putting stops, where there's vineyards and big machinery there, we've worked with them to limit bucket trucks going up too high and just being aware of the risks associated with working underneath high voltage electricity. So we don't have anything strictly in place, but we do have plans with multiple different avenues of catching and addressing the risk.
I wonder if we're some of the areas where, I don't know exactly if you have what is under the transmission line here, but maize, for example, with a combine harvester, or which is quite high. How do you, but that's not permanent, like a pivot. Is that something that you would, that's an arrangement you make with the landowner, or the understanding that you have to make with the landowner? It's not necessary for us to have anything in here to do with that land use post cultivation.
Correct. We wouldn't seek any regulation through the district plan to manage that. It's more that education, as far as I know, more education and awareness. So more on the softer side rather than through the district plan.
And we have actually looked at online harvesters all around the country. I worked with contractor down south, Quigley's contractors, which I don't know, have a presence up in Central Hawke's Bay. I'm Mid Canterbury boy. I'm from Mayfield, Ashburton, Ashway, from a farming background out there. My cousin works there, and we got all of the sizes of some of the biggest contracting gear in New Zealand at the moment, and we are comfortable in a lot of areas with combine harvesters going into the line, especially given the frequency, duration. You're going to harvest once or twice a year. Where we do have concerns, we've worked with those specific landowners, and we've worked to resolve that.
To your knowledge, that we haven't had any issues in CHP with the landowners, with the land use underneath the transmission line?
Might know, not to my knowledge.
No, nor mine.
When I broke down, I'm all good. Thank you.
Just a couple of points of clarification. And I think you should cover all this. Just in terms of evidence, paragraph 3. So, and that comes with the NPCT and as well. We'll just to clarify, so you're confident that the amendments that you've been accepted for providers recommendations that it's comprehensively covering like the NPCT.
Hamilton, sorry, I didn't mean to answer for you.
Sorry, I didn't. Was that directed at me? Because I didn't quite catch it. It was a little bit hard to hear that one.
It was in your evidence. So Transpower's approach to NPCT implementation. So
yep.
I just wanted for the record to confirm that the approach proposed from Transpower's perspective.
Yep.
Expectations of the NPCT.
Yes, it is. Yep.
Maybe if I just maybe comment on one aspect related to that. I noticed some of the policies in terms of they'll be addressed in hearing 7, I think it is.
That's my next one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Sorry, linkages. Actually, I was going to aim that at the report, just to note, of course, that there is that linkage. And that I'm not sure who it is that's going to be writing the utilities report. Can you just note that we have this linkage so that we can ensure that we cover it all? In terms of, that would be Ms. Whitney's evidence at paragraph 1.4, where she refers to the perspective that they're comfortable as long as policies the support is subject to the amendment of the National Grid specific policy in UP5 within the networks chapter. So we've got to get to that chapter. I just don't want to lose that connection in the conversation when we get to that report, so that we can cover it all as part of the decision making.
And for the sake of, I can also address in my evidence, I'll make a note as well.
If you could, please don't want to lose that linkage.
Agree, it's the final tick. It is, well, it's probably the one of the components as well in terms of showing. Yeah, it's not compromised.
And just a final point, just the, right. So we're on your paragraph, in the evidence, paragraph 4.4. That in some cases there are conceptual property rights to access new assets that are located on private land. Have you got any of those in the Hawke's or
In the central Hawke's Bay, I don't think so. To the best extent of my knowledge, we don't have anything other than our verbal agreements with your local landowners.
From my knowledge, that also does relate to the when the line was constructed. It's correct, Mr. Hamilton, in terms of 1942. So a lot of the easements, I think, probably get, as I understand it, would come into effect at later times.
Yeah, I think that's what's referred to as a statutory rights line, isn't it? There's statutory rights that are imposed under the Electricity Act of 1992, I think. There was some time frame. I'm not an expert in this, but we refer to those the old original lines as statutory lines. Newer lines are typically designated and have easements associated with them as well. But the vast majority of Transpower lines do not have any easement protection or designations for that matter.
any further questions? Thank you. Thank you for coming. Nice to see the face.
Yeah, that's good to see it, yeah.
Mr. Hamilton, I hope to see your face next time.
Yes, I think you will. I think you might see me closer to Christmas, so you'll have that pleasure to look forward to. Early Christmas present.
Nothing to do with the balmy sunshine of Central Hawke's Bay, which I admit I'm looking forward to. Yeah, coming out of Wellington.
My in-laws live here, so I was telling Ben about the Waipara book tree. So
Oh, yeah.
next about it as well. So.
I have to admit, we were quickly inducted into Power Pies too.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely got to get up there by the sounds of it. Good butchery in a pie shop. Sounds good.
Yeah, wine swayed for those.
They do a good mince and cheese, I think.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Have a good rest of the day.
Yeah. Way. Lucy, can you measure?
So we will our lunch break. Early, and I don't have the official authority from our chair to determine when our lunch break will be.
Run it on those can.
Huh?
Stay here.
Well,
No, this one.
yeah, if this able, we'll kind of So thank you, Mike.
Good afternoon. Hearing number 5 for the Central Hawke's Bay proposed district plan is reconvened post lunch, and we've got a multiple of topics, and I think you know what they are, so I won't cover them off. But next on the schedule of submitters to be heard are those from Kāinga Ora, Homes and Communities. We have received legal submissions and planning evidence on the topics, and we have read them. This morning we had some technical issues this morning in terms of the Zoom and things, but it might be worthwhile for Kāinga Ora. We did have some responses from the reporting planners on various topics. So it might be a benefit for Kāinga Ora to know what was said. So basically for earthworks in natural hazard areas, the reporting planner hasn't changed her view. Similarly with the flood hazard area overlay, it was question whether it would be wise to have natural hazard rules that apply to dynamic maps sitting outside the plan. So I would be interested in views on that point. In terms of subdivision, most of the points made with this morning were not changing view. There was a little bit of discussion around the use of restricted discretionary rather than controlled activities. Summarised by saying probably limited benefits for applicants to amend their activity status from discretionary to restricted discretionary. Before that, she hasn't changed her mind in terms of the minimum lot size from 350 to 300, and similarly, other matters haven't changed her view. So I just thought I'd share that with Kāinga Ora in case it influences what they're about to say. But otherwise, it's open to you. Nick, do you want to lead the charge?
Yes, thank you very much for that. Good afternoon. My plan was to throw to Mr. Campbell to present his planning evidence, and I really only have the one issue to discuss, which is the flood hazard mapping. And what I was going to say was that I was glad that it looked like the conversation had moved on from a question of lawfulness or vires, because it hadn't been raised here, although it has previously been raised in Tauranga and in Porirua. Tauranga Plan Change 27 adopts the approach that Kāinga Ora is recommending, and that has been appealed to the Environment Court. So the question of vires, I suppose, will be determined by that court, but the panel that heard Tauranga's Plan Change 27 considered that it was lawful, and in support of that there was a memorandum of counsel from Simpson Grierson, who were the council's lawyers in that case, confirming their opinion that it was lawful to
Would it be, Nick, for us to see a copy of that, do you think?
Yes, I can send that through. That's not a problem at all. It's publicly available on the council's website in the hearing portal for Plan Change 27. So I can do that, absolutely. I mean, it's specific to the Tauranga provisions, but generally what it says is that applying the tests for the lawfulness of rules to the rules in that plan, the opinion is that it's lawful. The point that it's made is that relying on the plans outside the district plan is not unlawful, as long as they are informing the assessment of the application of the rules that are obviously inside the plan. If you're going to the plans that are outside the district plan to determine whether a resource consent is needed, I think that would be a different question. But my understanding is that that's not what is proposed here. It certainly helps. It simply helps you inform helps inform the decision, whether the particular land is prone to flooding, and therefore, in terms of considering a subdivision application, the rules are triggered or not.
Sorry, Nick,
So,
can I just stop you there? Just so we have certainty and just go back to the planners. Is that your understanding?
well, I might, maybe in terms of the rules, that might be something that Mr. Campbell can address as well in his part of the hearing.
Oh, sorry. Did you want me to respond to that?
No. I was just waiting for a response as to whether that was.
No, that's fine. Sorry, I just
Okay.
wanted to just catch you at that moment if there was something the planners wanted to raise in terms of making sure that we have clarity on that point.
Oh, sorry, you meant the council planners. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, I was
You
pointing
probably
out.
can't see it
Sorry.
small scale.
Yeah, putting my hands into the ether. Yes.
So, well, look, the way I was going to address it was simply to say that it seems to me that there's growing recognition that as an approach, as a general approach, there's no question about lawfulness. Obviously, it needs to be determined within the ambit of the particular plan. I'm sure that it could be proposed in a way that was unlawful, but the way that it's being proposed here does not seem to me to be unlawful. And as I say, Auckland and Tauranga have accepted this position. It's currently before the hearings panel determining Porirua. They haven't made a decision yet. I don't know the time frame for that decision, but it can't be too far away. But I can certainly, after the hearing, send you a copy of the memorandum that was provided to the Tauranga panel.
Thank you.
Other than that, the only thing I was going to say, I might as well finish on this question of why Kāinga Ora submits that this is an appropriate way to address the question of flood hazard management, is that just because this is the way it's been historically done is not a sufficient reason to continue doing it. And the thing that seems to me in particular to make the or to have moved the dial, if I can put it that way, is that the rate of change is increasing. Things are not as obviously flood hazards, floodplains have always been dynamic, but in recent times the rate of change has been increasing, and that is what it seems to me is the factor that makes relying on a Schedule 1 process a no longer effective or efficient way to deal with these sorts of issues. But other than that, unless you have any questions for me on that point, I will hand over to Mr. Campbell to run through his evidence.
Just one from me. You mentioned that the national planning standards the mapping standards don't have any overlay for flooding. But there's no prevention on the council to have an overlay for flooding, is there, under the standards?
No, of course not. No, that's a fair comment. There's nothing to prevent them from creating one. But in terms of what MFE obviously considered would be likely most used, this wasn't one of them. I don't know that it's a particularly strong argument in favour, but it's a point that has been made before, and I thought was worth making again.
Thank you, Nick. Any questions for Mr. Whittley? No questions for you, Nick. So thank you very much. Matt.
Thank you.
Michael.
Kia ora, Commissioners, and thank you for accommodating me to present my evidence in teams. I wasn't proposing to read my evidence. I've taken that as read. I had a brief executive summary, which I was going to quickly touch on. I would note from the outset that there's quite a number of the submission points that were raised by Kāinga Ora were accepted by the council, and I've supported those changes, and I haven't put together evidence on those things. I've just basically adopted the 42A report. So really my evidence is really quite focused on a few points in relation to the three topics, and Mr. Chair, you covered on those points in the officer's right of reply. So I guess just in a similar order, in relation to the hazards and risks sections of the proposed plan, and we've kind of canvassed this, I still remain of the view that a more effective and efficient way to manage this aspect of the plan would be through a non-statutory layer. And I guess in my own experience, practicing not exclusively in Auckland, but predominantly in Auckland, that's an approach we've used with the Auckland Unitary Plan, to my mind, quite effectively. Recently, the council's GIS layer was updated with further flooding knowledge based on further modelling, and it's quite an effective way just to make sure that the most up-to-date information is captured and dealt with in relation to those issues, and particularly as Mr. Whittington identified, unfortunately with climate change and things like that, we are experiencing, changing weather conditions, and so, to my mind at least, it provides some flexibility to make sure that we're keeping on top of those issues. So that really dealt with the hazards area. In terms of the earthworks, I was reasonably comfortable with the approach to the earthworks. I simply raised that it wasn't necessarily clear to me that in the permitted activity standards for earthworks, which are reasonably flexible, it wasn't particularly clear to me that there was a standard that managed earthworks within a natural hazards area. And so I guess I was just simply raising the concern that the plan is quite flexible on the type of earthworks that could occur. I think from memory, up to 150% of a building platform. And so you could undertake some reasonably substantive earthworks, and potentially that could have impacts on an upstream or downstream catchment. So if the panel's satisfied that that's not an issue and that the plan can control that, then fine. I was just simply trying to assist the panel just to highlight that may have been a gap. I'm happy to be corrected if I've misinterpreted the plan there. And then finally, my evidence really looked at the subdivision section. And once again, I supported quite a lot of the changes, but in line with my evidence in relation to the residential section, I've suggested, in my opinion, reducing the minimum lot size down to 300 and providing the ability to undertake subdivision around an approved land use consent. I note you indicated that that the officers weren't minded to agree. I still do think it makes a difference that an application is restricted discretionary rather than a full discretionary, because in my experience, once you have an application for perhaps a combined land use and subdivision that's a full discretionary, it does potentially open up the consent to a full consideration of effects. And once again, to my mind at least, if you know the effects can be managed through the particular development, then it's in terms of encouraging housing and encouraging housing choice, the restricted discretionary approach is a good way to provide certainty to people who are seeking consent for different types of housing projects. And then secondly, I just reiterated the removal of our approach in relation to the noise provisions adjoining the state highway, which we'd also partly covered in previous evidence. So that's a very brief summary of my evidence. I had suggested some changes in Appendix A of my evidence, and I have prepared a Section 32A assessment in Appendix B, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that the panel may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I'll open up to the panel for questions. Taking it on one side, open up on the other. Okay.
And more just, you may have already covered it all, but just, I want to see a paper here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, thank you.
So just in the officer's report in earthworks and mining, And it's at paragraph 5.2.14. Here's Robert. In that, there was the question raised by the report officer, and again, apologies if you already dealt with it, about why the proposal for a 6 metre allowance, and whether it's based on the NZECP 34, which applies to all electricity lines and is not so specific to the national grid.
I think that was in relation to a submission that sought to reduce it from 12 to 6 metres. I haven't addressed that in my evidence. I've not offered a view on that.
Okay, so you'll just your existing submission will stand on that. But
it will, but I haven't offered any evidence in relation to that matter.
The 6 metres.
Yeah.
Do you have any perspective on the 6 metres at all?
Look, I was reasonably relaxed because my view was that the national line is really running through a rural environment, and so with respect to the matters that climate order would typically be concerned around in relation to a line running through an urban environment, then I think that may well have been a matter. But from my perspective, I was fairly nonplussed, if I could say, about that issue, and hence why I didn't prepare evidence.
No, I'm going to paraphrase the response from the reporting planner on the question of earthworks and natural hazard areas. And the point was made that she wasn't clear how the relief sought by the submitter could be achieved. This is in terms of short of requiring resource consent for any and all earthworks in an area of identified natural hazard, how it might be achieved in terms of earthworks effects within a natural hazard area. I'm not sure if you want to respond to that. There were some points around what other permitted earthwork standards would pick up on any natural hazard issues like slope, vertical extent, site reinstatement, and control of silt and sediment.
Yeah, I guess the fundamental concern or issue I was raising for the panel is around the potential for a landowner to undertake earthworks on their site. And I think the example I drew on was EWR1, which talks about, the ability to provide earthworks for up to, or no more than 150% of the area of an associated building footprint. And that could, when you're creating a platform like that, that's going to be a flat platform, which on sloping land has the potential for reasonably substantive earthworks, not just residential, but commercial areas as well. And so when you start getting into that, you start looking at reasonably substantial cuts and fills in order to build platforms. And in that context, those earthworks, if they're within a floodplain, for example, they have the potential to do a number of things. One, to impact on the upstream or downstream catchment, and also to impact on the flood capacity. If you're putting a whole heap of fill in a floodplain, that's going to potentially have upstream or downstream effects. So I guess those are the issues I was concerned about. In the context of examples in the Auckland Unitary Plan, apologies if I'm citing an Auckland plan, but is usually a consent trigger that requires a consent when you're undertaking earthworks within a floodplain. It may be the 1 in 100 year floodplain or the like. So there's a reasonably useful mechanism that says, right, if you're going to do these works in a floodplain, we just need to make sure that it's not going to result in any upstream or downstream effects. If I've read the rule incorrectly and it covers that situation, then that's fine. I just think there's a risk there for future development, that you could have upstream or downstream effects.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll hear no doubt from the planner on that. Okay. Sorry, I'm just also picking up and just in terms of this question about consents for subdivision after a land use consent's been granted. Your main point, just for my clarification, is that as a discretionary, if it's not a controlled activity, and therefore, consent has to be granted, etc., that it triggers the full discretionary activity.
Yes, I thought the reporting planner raised a good point around some of the challenges of it being a controlled activity. So I accepted that point. I just felt that a discretionary activity opens the application up to all effects. And to my mind, in the context of what I was proposing in terms of subdivision around an approved land use consent, the effects in theory are known and quantified because you're basically subdividing around a development. You're simply creating land tenure around an approved landform. And so the subdivision is quite a functionary activity, acknowledging that there might be some issues with making sure that easements are correct and things there. So restricted discretionary, having reflected on it and having considered the 42A report, I felt that was a good position to land on to deal with those issues.
And the final point made by the planner this morning was that if the panel was of mind to adopt a restricted discretionary status, that it would be appropriate that it only apply with non-compliance with the minimum net site area standard. I'm just trying to get your response to that.
I didn't quite understand the question. Sorry, Commissioner.
So that if we were in mind to agree with you and adopt a restricted discretionary activity standard for it, her advice was that it would be only apply where there's non-compliance with the minimum net site area standard.
Yes, I mean, I think I agree with that. I mean, the purpose of this is not to certainly not to be able to create vacant lots below the minimum standard. That's not the intention. There's an approach to deal with vacant lot subdivision. The intention is to provide just a bit more flexibility to be able to do subdivision around an approved land use consent.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm just trying to get my head what the question about a minimum net site area of 300 versus 350. To my mind, there's not a lot of difference. 350 is actually fairly common in my experience around places a minimum. But what to your mind is the if you can then summarize it, the benefit of a 300 square meter minimum lot area, other than maybe a cumulative, over time you'll get a few more extra houses and units than you would under 350.
Look, that simply is it. I think when we prepared our evidence in relation to the residential topic, and we looked at this with Mr. Ray, and we did, I'll have to call back, we did kind of look at some of the sites. We felt that it provided that ability to provide a little bit more flexibility to sites to be able to provide additional housing choice, and it might be that you can provide a bigger range of typologies in terms of family homes down to sort of 1 and 2 bedroom homes. So it's really around providing some more flexibility.
Right. So if you had a lot of 1,000 square meters or so, that 350 would only give you 2 sites, and 3 would give you 3 sites. And
correct. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions? No more questions for you. So thank you very much for your attendance and your flexibility. Are there any other points you may wish to make?
No, just to I just would like to acknowledge the officers' reports were very well laid out and really helpful. So really appreciated for a really professional approach.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Nick, too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Dean. You
Uh,
there?
Kia ora, yes, I am here and I am available if you'd like me to do my bit now.
That would be very much appreciated if you could.
Yes, so tēnā koutou katoa, I did tune into the opening session this morning from 9 o'clock. So I did hear Rowena's statement, especially in relation to the Heritage New Zealand points on Earthworks chapter. And I also had been trying to keep one eye on your timetable so that I could be available.
Thank you. Much
That's good. It's good to get ahead of time, not behind. Doesn't always happen.
Okay, so I was just sorry. So the two main points from this morning in respect to Heritage New Zealand was one, the whole setting of a historic heritage feature. So I think there's a bit of agreement around that at the moment between yourself and the reporting planner. The other main point was some agreement with your point or around triggering consents within sites containing wahi tapu places and sites of significance in the sites of significant Māori.
Yes.
The only thing there was she wants to give it a little bit further thought about the crossovers between the various chapters of the plan and how that might all work. But so yes, so she's going to respond further in the formal right of reply on that. Did you pick that up this morning?
Yes, I did hear some comment. I wasn't exactly sure what the concern may have been, but I'm sure she can, take more time to look at those in detail to see what needs to be done there, if anything.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I appreciate that response. And so I don't think I need to go much more into my evidence, because I guess if that position that I put forward in evidence has been accepted by Rowena, then there's not really in question anymore. So I appreciate that, but perhaps best if there's more questions at all, then I can answer that.
Okay, yeah, I was just looking at your statement of evidence and the two main points we've just talked about. So that's good, but I will open it up to the panel to see if there's any questions for you or clarification.
Sites of significance. You got a question while I phrase it in my mind again.
It's probably the same question.
Well, you ask it then.
I haven't phrased it either. No, we were trying, I don't know if you heard it, but we were having a conversation about in practice and approach. If we have, if we take out cultural sites and put in the word suggested, my question was around, was there a risk or gap in terms of being too specific? So are we pointing towards maps and then the risk that there will be earthworks and therefore we won't capture sites that haven't been mapped? And my understanding from the planners is that that's not the case. We're not talking about maps. And the conversation we started having was, well, what does that mean practically for a farmer who might dig, might find something? What is the process from there in terms of how does it work? And so we thought we'd talk to yourself just to see if you could run us through a hypothetical idea and explain to us what would happen. So they, if that happened, they would be pointed to Heritage New Zealand. They would be pointed to an accidental discovery. What would happen?
So I think if the additional standard which triggers a consent process for earthworks on a site containing a scheduled feature, if that's adopted, then you've got it's broader than just the point on the map which shows in the current proposed district plan, it's just a point. But it would be a broader trigger because it would encompass at least the land parcel. And then there's a process there of, I presume it would be a consent would involve consultation with Heritage New Zealand and with mana whenua representatives to identify what are the likely effects of the earthworks on that property. Maybe it would be acceptable. Maybe there's mitigation. Maybe it could be identified as a significant area which shouldn't be disturbed. So that at least is a consent process which can be triggered and addressed at the time. If the wording is culturally sensitive sites, then presumably that's broader than just what's in the district plan schedule, which would probably be appropriate in terms of capturing things, because the panel would be aware that not the current schedule of significant sites is not complete. The district plan itself acknowledges that, and there's a work probably outside the scope of this district plan, but there's definitely an intention to work with iwi to address that lack. So there are many places which aren't currently scheduled. So if the words, if that's more appropriate, what may be good is to include reference to SASMs. So the policy 7 could read something like sites and areas of significance to Māori and other culturally sensitive sites, so that it includes both what is currently scheduled and what may be put in a schedule in the future, plus others which can be identified as sensitive.
And in that instance, you're right. I think I'm just contemplating situations where that might happen. That's the conversation you were having in terms of providing some certainty. So in that situation, and you may not know, I won't be asking a silly question. So in that situation, the farmer may or may not be required to give consent to doing something. And so then we may be very dependent on, if the farmer discovers something, if they go and tell somebody and then we start a process. Is that work?
Yeah, that is, if there's no resource consent triggered, then it comes down to the landowner acting in good faith, really, and saying, look, I've discovered something, and they may choose to contact the council first. They may contact Heritage New Zealand, and then the process can be looked at. Do they need to apply for an authority, and that Heritage New Zealand Archaeological Authority process can kick in. But it's best if it's, if a place can be assessed first, so that it can be, the landowner can decide there's a risk of finding something there, so I should go through that process, or with advice from archaeologists and others, it may be decided that the risk is low, so we can apply an accidental discovery protocol to this work.
Yes, the difficulty is, of course, is that, as you said at the beginning, there's work to be done to get to the point of understanding where and where. Farming doesn't stop to wait for a process, so it'd be difficult to expect farmers to guess or stop and wait.
Yeah, I do. I'm going to be a bit broad, talk about a culturally sensitive site. What do you mean by that? What is a culturally sensitive site?
Well, I couldn't be the one to decide that. There's no definition in the district plan for what that word is, and that's probably in part triggering that submission point, or let's make something which is more concise. But I wouldn't want to narrow it down to only what's in a schedule.
Because my point is that there's say a farmer, just carrying on, if you've got a farmer there that's been, say decides he wants to put a hay barn on somewhere, and suddenly someone comes along and says, oh, that's culturally sensitive because my great-great-great-grandfather had a hut there. And it doesn't matter whether it's Maori or Pakeha or anyone. Would that be a culturally sensitive site, or would that be just, how would you, I get it if it's a Europa, but
Yeah.
what about if someone just had a hut there or something?
Yeah. I don't know if it's better to have it a more precisely defined term in that policy. Again, if there's a trigger for consent for at least earthworks on a property, say you might have a farm which has an identified feature, archaeological feature, along one part of a ridgeline, couple of 100 meters away, someone wants to do work. At least if it's on the same property, then there'll be a resource consent trigger. If there is no consent trigger, then the policy doesn't really come into play.
So you're saying that if someone decides to say put a factory in or something on a bit of land, and then someone comes along and says, well, that's sensitive to my culture or whatever, how do we deal with that? Because most farmers under the current plans, and it's not just Central Bay plan, but others, we don't have all of the marks. So my concern is in the future that someone will be doing what they consider as the right thing to do, and then so they get told, no, you're not allowed to. How will we manage that? How would that process go for them if they're being told that there could be a culturally sensitive site there?
Yeah, well, that again, your consents planner is only going to consider that policy looking at a consent process. If it's a full discretionary, then he can consider, the planner can consider every policy, including that, is it a sensitive site?
But I'm more talking about even if it didn't even need a consent process, and suddenly someone comes along and says, well, that's actually a sensitive site. What's the process if for the farmer or the businessman or whoever is building there? What would be their process to go forward? Could they carry on because they don't need a consent? Or
yeah, they could certainly carry on if they don't need a consent.
So then
It'd be a permitted activity.
Education more than
it's just my concern that
they could.
it's a grey area.
Yeah. Until the mapping is done and you have some more certainty. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Questions? I don't have any further questions. Thank you, Dean. But thank you for your flexibility and patience. Much appreciated.
Okay, very good then. Okay, thank you.
Nicole. Nicholas, sorry. Is he online? He wasn't last time. Oh, now he's online. How good. Thank you.
Students,
Just whoops, pause a minute while I get myself. Table submission from Rhea Jackson, big farmers around the points. But the floor is yours in terms of if there's other points you want to highlight this afternoon. Let me just check my notes from this morning. So, yeah, this morning, I don't know if you would have heard, but the reporting planner expressed that she hasn't changed her position in terms of retaining the 20-meter earthworks requirement. So you'll probably be pleased to hear that. But that goes back again to the Fed Farmers point, and I don't think there's more flag for you. Okay, so who would like to start? Would Graham or yourself?
Graham, did you have?
Graham.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, panel. I really don't have a lot to say other than what is in the statement of evidence. Turning specifically to what I understand the committee would like to hear from us on in relation to the Fed Farmers point, we're in complete agreement with the reporting planner on the need for retention of the 20-meter. It really is I think Fed Farmers just haven't got the point of why that 20 meters is there, and the reporting planner has got the point, and the point is that First Gas is not saying they necessarily want to absolutely prevent development occurring within that distance, but they would like to be notified and made aware of development applications that are within that, and that's particularly relevant in relation to subdivision, and particularly relevant in relation to potential earthworks associated with subdivision or associated with development, because quite clearly earthworks in the vicinity of the gas pipeline, particularly in rolling hill country, can give rise to questions of stability around the pipeline, and that's a matter obviously of significance and interest to First Gas. So really our position is we like what you are proposing to put in the plan. We support the reporting planners arriving at what we see as a sensible conclusion in relation to protecting from potential reverse sensitivity effects that may or may not happen, but should they happen, the consequences could be quite significant as far as First Gas is concerned for its asset. So we support the retention of that requirement in the plan. And I think with your agreement, Mr. Chairman, I'll leave it there and happy to answer questions, unless Nicola, you have anything that you would like to add further around operational matters.
Yeah, I think if I can add any value, it's more understanding how we work with landowners. And so I guess to support what Graham has said, and I think what's we're trying to find a reasonable solution to be able to take part and have a say where appropriate around certain activities whilst not impeding landowners unduly. So it's finding that balance, and that's really what we're trying to achieve here.
Okay, and I know we've had traversed this in an earlier hearing, but would you mind sort of covering this again in terms of reporting on this particular topic? That the evidence of readjustment said that it is already managed through the easements and safety campaigns. Do you have any comments around those 2 points?
Graham, would you like me to?
Yeah, you go, Nicola.
So our operating standard AS 2885 requires us to at least yearly with the landowners. So that is possibly some of the safety booklets that has been referred to. Our easement is 6 meters either side of the pipeline, and that is an area where any physical works within a private land you require the permit plans. So it's a free process, as Ria's picked up today. And it's to encourage people to come and talk to us and not be put off. So that easement area, she's correct, is managed by that permit process, and it does work well. Anytime a farmer wishes to clean drains, a local field tech come out, issue the permit. That's all good. What we're finding is that over time, since the pipeline's been put in, the easements have been there since that time, land use has changed, things change, and we just want the ability to have a say in those matters that might be on the boundary of the easement. So, for example, at the moment, houses can be built right up to the easement boundary legally. And I'm honest when I tell people that and have those conversations. But this is why we seek rules in the district plans to help manage those activities so that there are better outcomes for everyone. Not only the reverse sensitivity that has been touched on and Graham's mentioned, but also people like to build decks and have swimming pools and you know, on undulating land, they might need to do some retaining. And if that is too close to the pipeline, that can have a risk. So that's sort of, I guess that permit process is restricted to that 12 metres. And we're just seeing activities happen nearby, which possibly can impact pipeline operation.
When you said there's a yearly contact with, that must be a massive exercise.
Yes.
Right.
We're about 14,500 landowners, I think, out of my number. So we have a really good database. Sending out those yearly things. And it's like the calendar. I don't know if any of your name pipeline on, but send a calendar. That's another touch point. These are safety booklets. We even have a development booklet as well. Yeah, a lot of work goes into this.
Right, so it's more than just a passing. Oh, it's been 1 year. We're here.
Yeah, we also do contractor mail outs as well. We're trying to really look at other people who work around the pipeline. Yeah.
Okay, any questions for Graham or?
Just to confirm, in the report at 5.2.15 paragraph, and it's quoting the farmers. And it says that the gas pipelines have 100% easement. They're crossed over private land. Is it?
It took me a little while to understand that sentence, but I think perhaps what is being referred to as where we have the pipelines through Central Hawke's District, we do have easements on all of the land. That's my understanding. So I recall that I'm pulling that information together for the council. So I think that's what that refers to.
That was all.
Thank you.
Just to clarify, I've got a friend that's got a farm and I'm looking at his map right here with the pipeline running through it. And he informed me he didn't have an easement.
I'll have to check that specifically. I'm sorry. It's my understanding that we do have easements, or what may sometimes happens is when the Ministry of Works identified the pipeline alignment route, they did what's called a proclamation. And sometimes what was supposed to happen after that was an easement would follow more in line with what we know now. The proclamation still acts as a easement to some degree because it refers to the safe provisions of the Petroleum Act. And so I'm just assuming here, if he doesn't have a registered easement, it could be this proclamation, but it would be on the title, and that's my understanding.
Yeah, so when you made reference before about the fact that if they wanted to clean the drains out and that within that easement, you would come out and give them consent or permit, sorry. Is that a cost to the farmer or is no cost? Well, the other comment he made is he doesn't put the line pipes as deep as it's meant to be in his farm.
So under AS 2885, in a rural area, the pipe actually only has to be 700 mil deep. His gas policy is, hey, we'd like to be deeper than that. And I think generally we should, really depends, under rivers we're deeper. My understanding is about 1 point, sort of an average. So they're really not that deep.
No, they're not, are they?
No.
So he could potentially ram a post into it quite easily.
No, because he'll ring and get a permit and we'll be there and stop that. But that it is free because we want people to talk to us. We don't want them to be sneaking around the process because of cost. And that's why that is free.
I don't think he's going to do it on purpose.
Yeah.
Just if he doesn't know. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
I was just thinking, I was trying to look for the one of the original through the past hearing where I had a funny feeling as soon as Tim asked that question that there are no easements. We are all that other thing you said.
The proclamation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I think I remember asking about that, but I just can't, I haven't had time to find it. I've been very quietly trying to find it.
Yeah.
So I think, so I wondered, and I'm being a wee bit blunt here, whether First Gas is using the district plan as to go around the need to go and deal with all those landowners through easements and set those up properly.
Yeah, I don't believe so. And that proclamation, the way the act is worded and how those proclamations are worded, it's X amount of feet either side of the pipeline. So to all intents and purposes, that area is still the same. It's managed by First Gas. There is no change to that. And I'm happy just to reconfirm the extent of the easements, because it was a couple of years ago that we supplied the information. So I'm happy to check that if that's my confirmation of.
I'm not sure that it matters either way, but
Yeah, that's no problem.
Graham, is there anything you want to add to that?
The only point I'd make in relation to that is the history of pipeline construction in New Zealand has been a very long one, and a lot of these pipelines were put in place in the 80s. And generally, where if something has happened that a proclamation hasn't been transferred into an easement, it's generally a result of an administrative oversight rather than any deliberate policy by First Gas and its predecessors. I've been involved in planning issues around pipelines in New Zealand for nearly 20 years now, and I've only personally encountered one other property in the course of those investigations which did not have an easement. So I'd be very surprised if the proclamations were widespread in extent, particularly confined to Central Hawke's Bay district. It's more likely that they're spread around a bit and they're the odd site that sort of slipped through the cracks, as it were. But Nicola is absolutely correct. The legal effect of the proclamation is the same as the easement. There will be some paperwork somewhere on the land titles referring to that it's been a proclamation and as a result of a Gazette notice. So your friends and colleagues who have the pipeline in their land who say they don't have an easement, I would suggest that you ask them to go and have a look at the titles again, because it's highly likely that there'll be a Gazette notice reference there, which may not specify that it's a Gazette notice relating to the pipeline, and that may be why they haven't picked it up. But generally, in my experience, the pipeline has legal status pretty much everywhere it is, and the number of occasions where there isn't easements is relatively few and far between. And correct me if I'm wrong, Nicola, but your database of landowners doesn't distinguish, it's not just those that have easements, it's all landowners.
With the pipeline.
Yep.
Thank you. Any further questions? Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for your flexibility. It's very much appreciated, and for making the time to come here in person. Graham, for scheduling in your busy calendar.
That's perfectly fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you.
We've managed the hearing, which will please Commissioner Aiken as he needs to get away from me. Okay, with that, the hearing will be adjourned for the day, and we will. I'll respond. Yeah. That's a good point. I was thinking. Do you want to respond to today's matters or save it till tomorrow?
Put on a little
1 point. Okay. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I've just got only a couple of points. One to do with the last matter that Commissioner Taylor mentioned. I wonder whether your recollection is around the national grid.
I know, I was too.
Yeah.
Sort of go, I'm not seen to be corrected there, yeah.
Yeah, the National Grid has very few.
Yeah, I think that.
Yeah, because I literally just, we knew, talking about these, and I found first gas and, yeah, so apologies. I think.
Scarce. That we were looking about. They're looking for a diesel pipeline.
Yeah. So thank you and apologies for getting wrong.
Another small point, just in listening to the comments from Mr. Campbell this afternoon around the earthwork rule, EWR1. He kind of talked about an example of a large building platform under the specified earthworks provisions, and that could be quite a significant effect on natural hazards. And he talked about slope. Well, slope, I just want to refer the commissioners to the fact that slope is one of the aspects we still have to comply with. So you're talking about up to 22 degrees. So anything on a is still going to trigger consent. And my third minor point is in relation to just in relation to flood mapping, and that may be a matter for further discussion tomorrow when the regional council is here. I would be interested to know how often the flood modelling is done. From my understanding, the maps in the operative plan have been the maps since the 1990s, and the only update has been the update that's been provided. As a portal being adopted and proposed plans dealing with Mr. Goodyear's updates that have come through in submission. So I guess I'm wondering whether, I guess my understanding is that the river flood mapping on the hazards portal is possibly not as dynamic, and that it's not changing all the time, and more that it gets updated as new modelling is done. And I am just interested perhaps in knowing how often that happens in terms of how often that would trigger a plan change.
Okay, well, we can ask that question tomorrow. And just remember that he, in his written statement, Mr. Goodyear mentions that there's going to be further region-wide data available later part of this year. So you're aware of that.
Yes, so that's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Questions for the.
I did have one written down about the maps. I had some questions that I realised that I hadn't asked you this morning, but one of the things I wrote down is that Goodyear advised, quote, scaling is an issue and zooming in would need to come with a good disclaimer. And you said it was just to act as a trigger, but I was worried that it would actually result in more costs for the landowner. Like it's almost like that SNA ground truthing all over again. You know, would they have to, if it's flagged for flood risk, whether the maps are accurate or not? So if they then have to apply for something when that, and there's doubt over the accuracy of those flood maps, even though there's a warning there, is that?
They would have to spend, sorry, to pick up, they would have to spend money to say why a bit of land they're looking at actually isn't a flood hazard. It's just a sort of result of a grainy mapping system or something.
So yeah, unfortunately, it's nature of triggers. I guess the only thing to recall as well is that the way that the provisions in the natural hazards plan or natural hazards section works is around for flood hazard. If you're doing small buildings or you're doing single level residential buildings, that's permitted. So it's only going to be if you're doing something more substantial than that.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
True, I always forget that step, yep.
and that's all I have.
I think that'll learn me for eyeballing you while I'm supposed to be listening to lawyers. The question with Mr. Whittington, as I understand it, my question was, his comment was is that the approach is being taken is legally appropriate because the external maps are not required to determine if consents are required. That's what I took from his approach. Is that accurate? Or, I mean, you can think about it. I just wasn't sure. I just picked that up.
The maps and the proposed plan as it stands at the moment, the maps are the primary source for triggering consent. So the consent relies on maps. So I'm not aware of the situation with Tauranga or even with Plymouth, which I can have a look at that, but it may be that it is more about the assessment matters getting triggered. In which case it's a bit different.
Yeah, I was just a bit confused. So if you can just provide some clarity.
Okay, thank you very much. But do feel free if any other points occur to you to raise tomorrow afternoon from today. Because that's when the hearing will officially wrap up. So last chance to eat. Okay, with that, unless there's any other matters you want to raise, I'll adjourn the hearing for today and we'll resume it tomorrow at 9 o'clock, isn't it? Sorry. So we have Stella August first thing at 9 in person. Hawke's Bay, both Gavin and Craig will be online. Matuma all in person. In person in the afternoon. So thank you very much, everyone, and I'll be doing the hearing.